At the end of the Middle Ages, a nation emerged out of the vast borderlands between Europe and Asia. This nation became Russia. A dynasty of Viking princes founded this nation and lifted it to greatness. But the most powerful ruler of the dynasty, Ivan, called the Terrible, brought it to ruin. Winston Churchill described Russia as a riddle wrapped inside a mystery, inside an enigma. Even today, when the new Russia after the fall of communism is open to scrutiny, the land retains its sense of mystery, and its history remains complex and enigmatic.
There's no question in my mind that there is not one Russia, but that there are many Russias. And there's also very little question in my mind that there are many different Russian histories.
Is there a Russian nation? Yes, there is a Russian nation. What is it? 1,000 different things, depending on what you want it to be.
What makes Russia particularly different is firstly its sheer size. It is, after all, the biggest country on earth. And secondly, I suppose, the fact that it is Europe, but then again it isn't quite Europe.
The story of Russia began long ago, before Stalin, before Lenin and the Bolsheviks seized power from the Romanov dynasty, which itself had ruled for 300 years. But even the Romanovs were relative newcomers. The birth of the Russian Empire reaches back over 1,000 years, to an age when history is entangled with myth, and politics utterly intertwined with religion. At the peak of its power, the empire of the Tsars spanned 1/6 of the globe, from the glorious cities of St. Petersburg and Moscow in the west, across the endless forests of Siberia, to the shores of the Pacific and beyond.
The land which is currently Russia is of course enormous.
The distance between one end of the Russian Empire and the other end of the Russian Empire is the same as the distance from Moscow to Chicago.
And part of the story of the history of Russia is the filling up of that space.
The land that became Russia was never a single country, and the Russian people never a single race. Turks and Slavs, Mongols and Finns. Russia was and is a nation of many nations, a land not of one people, but many very different peoples.
All those groups have different patterns of settlement, obviously speak different languages, and have no sense of being part of a coherent land at all.
Before Russia became a nation-state, what connected the indigenous Slav people of the Eurasian frontier country were rivers, wide, seemingly endless rivers.
Rivers were the highways, rivers were the roads, the rivers were the connections between the widely scattered populations. The rivers provided the force lines drawing people together.
The rivers are absolutely essential to the expansion of the Russians in every direction and to the creation of this kind of enormous state. Without the rivers, they could never have held it together.
In the 9th century, Viking warriors sailed down the rivers that marked the borders of Europe, the Dnieper, the Don and the Volga. In so doing, they pioneered new trade routes, shortcuts to the riches of Arabia and the Orient, through Constantinople. The Slav inhabitants of the river valleys called the Vikings the Rus, and as they battled and bartered their way to power, the frontier territories between Europe and Asia became known as the land of the Rus, Russia.
One of the stories of Russian history is how gradually links are forged in a very small way, strands emerge, beginnings of connections happen and begin to intertwine. Then one turns around and, good heavens, we have a place called Russia.
By the late 10th century, the land that would become Russia was a patchwork of warring city-states, where rival Viking chieftains fought each other for supremacy. The greatest of these city-states was Kiev, and Vladimir, Grand Prince of Kiev, was the most powerful man in the land of the Rus. he consolidated his realm from the Baltic to the Ukraine. But Vladimir wasn't content to be the first among equals. The Grand Prince wanted supreme power and to reign over the Rus by divine right.
One of the things which a would-be ruler of that large and diverse land needed was some central focus of authority, some sort of central cult which would give him a legitimacy and authority beyond simply the use of military force.
In the legends relating to the birth of the Russian nation, it was written that Prince Vladimir set out to search for a single religion that would bind together the many pagan peoples of the Rus. According to the story, Vladimir dispatched emissaries to meet the Jews, the Muslims and the Catholics in a quest to find the one true faith. His men arrived in Constantinople, and there, in the heart of the Christian Orthodox world, Vladimir's envoys at last found the glory their Grand Prince desired.
The envoys went to Constantinople and were so impressed by the sheer aesthetic beauty of it. We saw such beauty there, we did not know whether we were in heaven or on earth. We only know that God must live in that place.
The splendor and wealth of Constantinople persuaded Vladimir to convert to the Christian Orthodox faith. He made a pact with the Byzantine emperor and married his sister. Then, as God's representative on earth, he commanded that all his subjects be baptized as Christians or face his wrath. In 988 AD, Prince Vladimir united the land of the Rus by creating a Christian state. He encouraged education and reformed the legislature. But at his death, he left his kingdom divided among his sons. War between the rival brothers threatened to tear the newly unified kingdom apart. One of Vladimir's sons, Svyatopolk, was determined to rule alone, but he feared that his brothers, Boris and Gleb, would stand in his way.
Boris and Gleb were not interested in seizing power, but Svyatopolk doesn't trust them. He's described in the text as lawless, as though he were outside Christian morality. And he decides to kill them.
Boris was alone at prayer when his brother's henchmen found him. He knew a fight for the throne would tear his beloved land apart. He chose instead to show no resistance and die for the unity of the nation. The murderous drama was repeated as the killers slaughtered the tyrant's other brother, Gleb. According to a witness, they fell upon him like wild beasts and overcame him by piercing him with sharp blades. Svyatopolk's treachery ignited an open rebellion. The Rus arose to avenge the blood of the murdered brothers. Ironically, the tyrant was driven into exile, while Boris and Gleb were canonized as the first saints of the Russian Orthodox Church. Their sacrifice consecrated the new religion of the Rus with martyrs' blood.
That's the significance of Boris and Gleb. They're innocent sufferers. They accept the blows of the lawless Svyatopolk, and in accepting those blows, they act out the passion of Jesus.
By the slaughter of Boris and Gleb, Russia's church and rulers achieved sanctified authority for their control of power. But for Russia, the country, the new unity and internal stability of the nation was immediately threatened from outside. Before long, invaders from the east turned their attention to the land of the Rus. In the year 1223, having conquered the east, the Mongol horde, the sons of Genghis Khan, unleashed their fury on the west and overran the southern steppes. The Mongol horde, one of the most formidable fighting forces in history, was composed of tens of thousands of men on horseback, organized to murderous perfection. By 1240, they had subdued all the Russian principalities. In over 1,000 years of Russian history, only the Mongols ever accomplished such a comprehensive victory.
They came in huge numbers. They came prepared for long-distance campaigns.
Their campaigns would normally have between maybe 50,000 to 100,000, and if we're to believe some sources, well in excess of 100,000 soldiers.
Mongol horsemen trapped whole contingents of Russian soldiers and cut them to pieces. They captured Russian rulers and held them hostage. They torched towns and reduced them to ashes. In 1240, the Mongol leader Batu Khan, the grandson of Genghis Khan, laid siege to the city of Kiev, the administrative and religious capital of Russia. His messengers sent this warning: "If you surrender to me, you will be forgiven. If you resist, you will suffer greatly and perish cruelly." Kiev refused to submit to the invaders, and the greatest city in the land of Rus was reduced to a smoldering ruin. Some accounts claimed that when the Mongols rode on westwards, they left Russia littered with the skulls of the dead. So began the reign of the Mongols. It would last for 250 years.
The Mongols are going to create the largest contiguous land empire the world has ever known. They saw as almost part of their birthright, as almost part of their divine right, that they ought to rule as much of the world as possible.
The leaders of the horde were Mongol warriors. Their soldiers were Turkic tribesmen from the east. In time, the Russians came to call them all by the name Tatars. The Tatars never attempted to occupy Russia, only to dominate the land through tribute and intimidation. Their use of terror tactics, first used in their conquest of China, was legendary.
There are a number of instances where the Mongols in Central Asia would lead out parts of the population onto an open plain where they would systematically kill the population, sometimes decapitate them.
The Mongol stranglehold reduced the princes of Russia to vassals. Before any new ruler could ascend his throne, he would have to travel to the court of the Tatar Khan at Sarai on the lower Volga, literally cap in hand, to feed the horses of his overlords. After this humiliation, he had to hand over a large sum of money as a tribute to the Khan and as payment and authorization for him to assume power.
So long as the Mongols got what they wanted, so long as they got the money and men which they required, then that was fine. They were not interested in any more. They were not interested in settling in Russia particularly. They were interested in what they could extract. It was a parasitic existence, but it's not in the parasite's interest to kill the host.
The Tatar Khan chose one of the princes to govern the Rus in his stead. The giver of the richest tribute was awarded the title Grand Prince and given authority over the others under Mongol military and financial control. Brother fought brother as rival noblemen competed for the honor. The principle of divide and rule served the Mongols well. Only a united people could ever be strong enough to rise against them. Over time, the rulers of one city-state learned how to manage the Mongols. Moscow was founded as the city-state of Muscovy. It began as an isolated defensive outpost on the Moscow River around 1147. It was situated at the center of two supremely important trade routes, and by the early 1200s, Moscow was a thriving city built around a great citadel, the Kremlin. In 1325, the new ruler of Moscow, Ivan I, negotiated a deal with the Mongols. Ivan would collect tribute for the Khan not just from the Principality of Moscow, but from all adjoining lands as well. His role as taxman soon earned Ivan the name Kalita, moneybags.
Moscow learned to use the Mongols well. The Muscovite princes over time will come to monopolize the title to the Grand Prince of Vladimir, and they could not do that without Mongol support.
As Moscow grew, of course, it had more money than anyone else, and it could assume military leadership. of the Russian principalities, of which there were, 50 or probably more.
As power and prosperity grew, so did disaffection. Moscow's princes chafed under the yoke of the Mongol overlords, and gradually the Muscovites acquired the resources to build an army and turn against their oppressors. In 1380, Dmitry, Moscow's new Grand Prince, rallied over 50,000 warriors from across the land. On the banks of the River Don at Kulikovo, Dmitry Donskoy led the land of the Rus into battle for freedom from the Mongol horde. According to a chronicle of the time, they swept into battle like two powerful storms, their weapons glittering like lightning. Blood flowed down the valley and mixed with the River Don. Tens of thousands died. Dmitry was pulled near death himself from underneath a pile of corpses. Miraculously, he survived. He had won a significant battle, but the power of the Mongols was by no means broken, and barely 2 years later, they returned in force. Moscow was attacked and destroyed. 100 years of struggle for liberty had only just begun.
There was no set-piece occasion on which the Russians said, "Mongols, you are going," and the Mongols said, "Oh no, we're not," and the Russians said, "Oh yes, you are," and the Russians then threw them out. The end of Mongol rule was a process, not an event.
While internal power struggles weakened the Mongols, Moscow was rebuilt and grew. By the late 15th century, the wealth of Moscow's new ruler, Ivan III, who took power as Grand Prince of Russia in 1462, rivaled the Mongol Khan. Ivan was tall, lean, very handsome, and a consummate negotiator. For 2.5 centuries, Muscovite rulers had paid the Mongols for the privilege of local power. In 1480, Ivan pulled the plug.
Ivan III eventually said, "No, we're not going to pay tribute anymore, as if you were our overlords. We will simply not do this anymore, and see what you can do about it."
Faced with a united front, the Tatar armies could no longer dominate the battlefield or the lands of the Rus. The Mongols conceded control to Moscow and its ruler. Ivan III had united the Russians under the banner of Muscovy and beaten back the Mongol horde. Soon he would take a new title for himself, Tsar, absolute imperial ruler of all the Russias. In 1453, Constantinople, the holy city of the Eastern Orthodox Christian Church, had fallen to Turkish Muslim invaders. The Eastern Roman Empire, Byzantium, was no more. However, a new empire and a new emperor would soon be born in the Christian Orthodox citadel in Moscow, because Ivan III decided to transform his dominions into a holy Russian empire. For centuries, the double-headed eagle had been the symbol of absolute authority in Byzantium. Ivan now adopted it as his personal emblem. In 1472, to cement his line to the old imperial blood, he took a wife, Zoe, known in Russia as Sophia, who was a niece to the last Byzantine emperor. Moscow's new royal family even created a family tree, tracing their line back to Rome and the Caesars.
Ivan III's wife was quite influential in telling him, you no longer need to be the first among equals, but you need to be the autocrat, the Tsar, the Caesar.
And so, in 1493, the Muscovite ruler began to use the imperial title of the Byzantine emperors, Tsar, which is Russian for Caesar. As Ivan remodeled himself as a Russian Caesar, he also remade Moscow into a new Rome, an imperial holy city. Sophia had brought with her some of the finest Italian artists and craftsmen. In 1475, Ivan also summoned 5 famous Italian architects and charged them with raising monuments to God's glory and Moscow's new power.
The Kremlin becomes a sacred Christian center. That is where the great cathedrals of Moscow are built. You might liken it to the imperial city in Beijing and the Chinese emperor's sacred inner city.
The architects enlarged and restructured the fortress of the Kremlin itself. They encircled it with stone ramparts 5 meters thick and crowned it with 19 towers. This was a royal city within a city, graced with 2 stone palaces in the Italian style, armories and many cathedrals, churches, and the world's largest bell. In the vast lands outside Moscow, Ivan the Great, as he became called, also began to change the rules of life for Russia's rural majority. Once peasants had been free to farm wherever they found open land. By paying tax or tribute, they could grow crops on fields belonging to noblemen or the church. If the land became worn out or taxes became too onerous, the farmers moved to greener pastures. Tsar Ivan issued decrees crippling the peasants' traditional right to roam. Henceforth, only once a year, in the depths of the Russian winter, could peasants leave one landlord for the fields of another. The peasants were not yet serfs, that is, slaves bound to the land, but Ivan the Great had begun their journey into bondage. Ivan's death in 1505 brought his son Vasily to the throne, and perhaps the most historic act of Vasily Ivanovich was not as an empire builder, but as a man determined to continue the dynasty. He locked away his first wife, Salomea, in a convent. She had failed to give him a child. In a concerted attempt to produce an heir, he took a new bride, Yelena. The Orthodox Patriarch of Jerusalem condemned this second marriage as sinful.
You will have a wicked son. Your states will be prey to terror and tears. Rivers of blood will flow. Your cities will be devoured in flames.
The Patriarch's dire prophecy proved all too true. On the 25th of August, 1530, the omens at the birth of Vasily's son were awesome. Legend says that the sky split open and lightning struck the Kremlin. That night, the future Ivan IV, heir to the Russian throne, was born. Bells were rung to spread the news throughout the land. Far to the east, a Tatar ruler, the Khan of Kazan, warned that Russia's new prince was born a monster. He said, "A sovereign has been born to you, and he already has 2 teeth. With one, he will devour us. With the other, he will devour you." The tyrant, known to history as Ivan the Terrible, had been born. But from birth, young Ivan was a prisoner of the Kremlin and its intrigues. In 1533, the death of his father Vasily, which brought Ivan to the throne when he was only 3 years old, resulted in a vicious power struggle. The young Grand Prince could only watch in bewilderment as Russia's powerful noblemen, the boyars, fought each other for control. At 17, the year in which he was crowned Tsar, he had to watch impotently as his uncle was dragged off and killed before his eyes.
The boyars ruled. They ruled very poorly. Each one of these cliques tried to steal as much as possible, to grab as much property as possible, to break the treasury.
Between his birth and by the time he came of age, in 1547 and became crowned Tsar, there are at least 14 murders that took place.
Black-hearted intrigue saturated the Kremlin. Even Ivan's mother, Elena, a Lithuanian princess who dominated the Regency Council, may have been a victim. She died when he was just 7, poisoned, some claimed, by rivals trying to seize power and use her child as a pawn. As he came to manhood in this dreadful climate of violence, loveless and isolated, Ivan began to show a cruel streak.
When he became an adolescent, he was quite wild. Sometimes he would amuse himself by throwing dogs and cats out of the belfry of the Ivan the Great Cathedral, so the cruelty had been nurtured in him from his childhood.
Whenever possible, he escaped from the heavy ceremonial robes and stifling rituals inside the Kremlin to go hunting. He read a lot and plotted his revenge. According to some accounts, it was at a Christmas banquet in 1543 that the 13-year-old prince made his first real bid for power. As rival boyars gorged themselves, the young Prince Ivan stood up and accused the powerful Shuisky family and others of treachery. "You have all conspired to steal my throne," the boy said, "but I will be satisfied if one among you, Prince Andrei Shuisky, is punished."
He had a kennel and he kept dogs. And one time, when Andrei Shuisky was walking in the Kremlin, Ivan told the kennel master to sick the dogs on him, and the dogs ripped Prince Shuisky apart.
Shuisky's death was Ivan's warning to boyars who dared try and usurp his power. If wearing the crown called for terror, Ivan was ready to use it ruthlessly, even if that meant an orgy of bloodletting. On the 16th of January 1547, the minarets of the cathedrals of the Kremlin glittered with gold for the coronation of Ivan Vasilievich. Not content to be crowned merely Grand Prince, the 16-year-old reached into the past for the authority of an emperor. At the suggestion of the clergy, he resurrected the title used only occasionally by his grandfather, Ivan the Great, the old Russian word for Caesar, Tsar.
The formal adoption of a coronation ceremony of Ivan IV as Tsar was part of the process of transition from a Muscovite principality to a Russian empire.
The term Tsar is not an official title. It's not going to become an official title for the Russian rulers, the Muscovite rulers, until Ivan the Terrible in 1547.
The first prince to be formally crowned Tsar, Ivan's imperial title echoed the immense scope of his realm. From the Ural Mountains at Europe's eastern edge to the headwaters of the great Dnieper and Volga rivers, Russia already covered an area twice as large as England, France, and Spain combined. And all across this vast territory, one teenager reigned supreme. Under Ivan, all power was concentrated in the Tsar's hands. The aristocracy held no hereditary land or power. The nobles, called boyars, owed their posts and authority directly to him.
Nobody had any individual rights that he was born with. These people, boyars, they were made by the state, appointed by the state, and if the ruler felt like it, could be removed by the state. And everybody knew it.
The Tsar's powers were absolute, a tradition Ivan's successors would continue to defend until the death of the Tsarist Empire in 1917.
If we are to say that our people still, to this day, have some affinity for the monarchy, the foundation for this was laid by Ivan the Terrible. He preached the ideology of autocracy.
With all Russia subjugated to his command, Ivan decided to expand. He dispatched armies to extend his dominions, both east and west. Under its new Tsar, the land commonly called Muscovy would become a nation of many lands, a true empire.
Usually when one talks about empire, one talks about absorbing other kingdoms and making them part of one's own dominion. And that's what Russia really did for the first time in the mid-16th century.
In 1552, Ivan and his army laid siege to the Tatar stronghold of Kazan. The fortress of the Khan commanded the lower Volga basin, the old trade route to the riches of the Orient. While his warriors stormed the gates, the Tsar prayed. The Tatar fortress fell. Ivan's armies of the east didn't even pause for breath. By 1556, they controlled the Volga river route all the way to the Caspian Sea. Kazan and Astrakhan, ancient strongholds of the Tatar Khans, were brought firmly under Russian rule.
During the reign of Ivan the Terrible, he expanded at the rate of something like, on the average, 50 square miles per day during his reign. It was an extraordinary thing, a feat bested only by Americans in their drive toward the Pacific from another coast.
To commemorate his glorious victories, Ivan erected a spectacular monument in the heart of Moscow, the Cathedral of St. Basil the Blessed. A masterpiece of architectural art, St. Basil's would also become a symbol of Russia itself. Ivan's passion for power was matched in the early years by his love of his wife, Anastasia. He chose his own bride, the pretty 15-year-old daughter of a modest Moscow family of boyars. Her family name was, portentously, Romanov.
Царицей, он ее очень любил.
When she was his wife, the Tsaritsa, he loved her very much. There were no executions. He behaved very well. All of his contemporaries remember this as the finest time of his reign.
Ivan IV was in his glory years, ruling over a land which was rich and strong. His empire was in the ascendant, and his influence was courted by the great states of Europe, Poland, Turkey, France, and even England. And in 1554, his wife Anastasia, whose first son had died in infancy, delivered the Tsar a healthy heir to the throne, Ivan Ivanovich. But then in 1560, fate seemed to take a turn against Ivan. A great fire swept across Moscow. Anastasia fell sick with a high fever. Ivan never left her side, praying incessantly for God to spare his beloved wife. His pleas were answered only by her death. A new and terrifying Ivan emerged from the ordeal. The paranoid fears of his youth were reignited. Poison had taken his mother. Had Anastasia been poisoned too? Was his throne now the object of a dark conspiracy?
After the death of Anastasia, that particular death is really part and parcel of a much larger complex, of which Ivan no longer can begin to trust completely the boyar families that are around him.
The Tsar turned viciously on his advisors, military heroes, trusted noblemen, anyone he was suspicious of. Many were thrown into prison and subjected to torture, banishment, or summary execution. A bitter saying came into being: the closer to the Tsar, the closer to death. The Tsar came to be known as Ivan Grozny, a word that translates most precisely as awe-inspiring, but most commonly as terrible.
The nickname Terrible came from Ivan Vasilievich Grozny himself. In his own essays, he would state, "A Tsar has to inspire terror." That is, he wanted to be called that.
Ivan alienated even his very closest allies. In 1564, his most senior general, Prince Andrei Kurbsky, left the field of battle and fled to Poland. He was exiled. Soon afterwards, an angry letter from the general arrived at the Tsar's court.
Monarch who was once blessed by the Lord, but who is now corrupt to the depths of his soul, why have you murdered the illustrious warriors whom heaven had given you?
These heartfelt accusations drove Ivan beyond breaking point.
All of this together seems to intimate to Ivan that he still has very real internal enemies.
Finally, on a freezing December day in 1564, Tsar Ivan IV gave in. He decided not to endure another power struggle, and he quit the Kremlin.
He appealed in a letter to the Moscow people, complaining that he was leaving the post of Tsar because he was not being allowed to rule, that they are stealing, and he is not being allowed to punish them.
The Tsar left Moscow in a fury to occupy a makeshift court at Alexandrovskaya Sloboda. He left this message: with a heart filled with sorrow, no longer wishing to endure your betrayals, we have given up governing the country and have left to settle in whatever place God may lead us. Ivan Grozny, Ivan the awe-inspiring or Ivan the Terrible, had renounced the throne. The empire had no Tsar, the people no ruler, and Russia was deep in the ice and snow of a dreadful winter. December 1564. Tsar Ivan IV had abandoned the Kremlin and renounced his crown. He had been Russia's absolute ruler for over 30 years. Without him, the people feared the country would fall apart. That was exactly what Ivan expected and wanted.
By abdicating, he removes himself from the religious and also the political constraints that bound him when he was an official Tsar.
This was a coup d'etat, which he performed because he knew he was going to be asked back to be the Tsar. He knew that the mood of the people was against the boyars, especially the people in Moscow.
The people came to him and they said in one of the classic Russian phrases, something to the effect that sheep cannot be without a shepherd. You may do whatever you want.
Ivan agreed to return, but on one condition. He must have a free hand to rule Russia as he pleased and punish his enemies in any way he chose. 2 days after Ivan's return, the slaughter began. At the foot of the Kremlin ramparts, he killed his perceived enemies, ordering the execution of hundreds of boyar nobles, councillors, even clergy. He said they had opposed his wars, evaded his taxes, questioned his sanity, and that they must pay with their lands and their lives. To crush all opposition, the Tsar unleashed the oprichniki, his personal armed force of henchmen, 6,000 strong. They were cloaked in black and subject to rigid monastic discipline and the evil wishes of their master.
These were people recruited from some dregs of society who could ride a horse, and these people put a death's head on the pommel of their horse and would go around terrorizing the population.
Reminiscent of the forces of the Inquisition in Spain, the oprichniki conducted a reign of religious terror.
They would dress like monks. They would act as though they were in some kind of quasi-monastery, and yet at the same time, they would be engaged in terrible killings. They would be engaged in terrible tortures.
The Tsar himself, it was said, developed a connoisseur's appreciation for the finer points of torture.
He would sometimes even invent special executions, which were not just executions, but also showpieces. For example, he would blow monks up on top of a powder keg. He would say, "You want to be like the angels? Well, here you go."
Ivan's sadism was laced with grisly humor and also pious superstition. To purge the earth of his enemies, he would massacre not just his opponents, but their entire families.
What it does is to leave no one of the family to pray for the dead. And by leaving no one to pray for the dead, it's as though Ivan was stretching his power into God's world, into the heavens or perhaps into hell.
As his crusade of terror swept the land, only madmen or the insanely devout dared to challenge the Tsar.
As Ivan approached the city of Pskov, this holy man, this holy fool, came up before Ivan and offered him some raw meat dripping with blood. And Ivan said, "I do not eat meat during Lent." And the holy fool said, "But you drink Christian blood."
Ivan waged war against his own people for almost 8 years. When Russia's real enemies attacked from outside, the nation was too weak and demoralized to resist. In 1571, Russia's old nemesis, the Tatars, took advantage of the situation. The Khan of the Crimea and his warriors swept north, invaded Russia and sacked Moscow. Flames engulfed the wooden metropolis. In 3 hours, the city burned to the ground. Over 60,000 people died that day, and countless documents were incinerated. In the aftermath of the disaster, Ivan's madness seemed to ebb away. Faced with a capital in ashes and a land in ruins, the Tsar abolished his private army. But the damage had already been done. The brutality of the oprichniki, coupled with the demoralization and disease which followed the invasion, withered the heart and soul of Muscovy.
If we are to believe the statistics that have survived, some of the areas of Muscovy are 50%, 60%. Some of them are 80 and 90% depopulated.
Nevertheless, Ivan's lust, not only for blood, but passion, was far from spent. After the death of Anastasia, he married several times, in fact, rather more than church rules permitted, and he also took lovers of both sexes. His amorous intentions even extended as far as the English court of Elizabeth I.
He actually investigates the possibility of a marriage proposal to Mary of Hastings, who was a lady-in-waiting in Elizabeth's court, and who is related to Elizabeth herself. And this, too, would have made for a rather strange juxtaposition, Moscow and London, in the age of Shakespeare.
The Tsar did not need a wife to breed an heir. The succession was assured. Ivan's eldest surviving son, the Tsarevich, shared his father's thirst for knowledge and power, perhaps even for cruelty. But on a November evening in 1581, Ivan's terrible rage overcame his reason. The Tsar had never been happy with his son's choice of bride. That night, his disapproval of his daughter-in-law, who was pregnant, boiled over into violence.
Ivan was furious at the dress of his daughter-in-law and was furious at the way she behaved towards him, which he took to be as a sign of disrespect, and possibly may have begun to manhandle her.
The son turned on the father. The Tsar responded in fury. Blinded by anger, Ivan struck out with his heavy iron staff. The Tsarevich, the son of his great love Anastasia, was struck dead by Ivan himself. Following the tragedy, Ivan's life seemed to unravel, vacillating between debauchery and austerity. Accounts say the Tsar felt haunted by the thousands he had killed, including his own son. He rehabilitated many of his victims posthumously.
He had executed a great number of people, and as a religious person, he tried to seek absolution for this sin, the terror. As part of that, he ordered that the names of all those who perished during the terror be written down.
As his health began to fail, Ivan summoned a number of mystics and soothsayers from the north to look into the future. Using some spiders as a means of divination, they foresaw only his death. They even named the date, the 18th of March, 1584. In despair, Ivan was carried each day to his treasure chamber to caress his precious stones, ruby and diamond, onyx and coral, which he believed had curative powers. Horribly bloated, Ivan was playing chess on the eve of the 18th. He fell in a swoon, and not long before midnight, the Tsar died. Tsar Ivan IV had raised Muscovy from a principality to an empire. His early years were full of promise and economic and political progress, but the brutality that later transfixed his nation also destroyed his heir, leaving only his sickly, feeble-minded second son, Fyodor, to inherit the throne. Ivan had shattered a dynasty that stretched back over 7 centuries, and the empire he had worked so hard to create hurtled into chaos.